Hello and welcome. This is Working Class to World Class. But before we go any further, I do have a little favour of you. If you could hit that follow or subscribe button, then that would be a massive help. Thank you. In this episode, I chat with one of the most well-known broadcasters in Scotland. As a little kid growing up in the high flats, he could never have imagined in a million years that he would have interviewed so many Prime Ministers and every single First Minister of Scotland. Breaking through the barriers of adversity. I'm Lynn Lester, and this is Working Class to World Class. So Bernard, welcome to Working Class to World Class. I'm so glad that you were able to do this podcast with me.
Delighted to be here. This is my first day of retirement after 34 years in commercial broadcasting. I retired yesterday and did not get into the wee small hours in the best traditions of Scottish journalists. So I'm a wee bit fragile, Lynn, so don't ask anything too complicated.
I was going to say just the way I like it. Not at all. You're in very, very safe hands. Now, there's a lot of people that are going to be tuning in from all around the world. So there'll obviously be Scottish people who will know you well, people perhaps in England, but there's lots of people from America and Asia that's also going to tune in. So how would you best describe how you are, I guess, best known?
Well, I'm probably best known in Scotland as a broadcast journalist. I've been with the main commercial broadcaster in Scotland, that's Scottish Television, or STV as it's known locally, for 34 years. For 19 of those years, I was political editor of the station between 2000 and 2019, and then for the last 5 years, a special correspondent where I was doing sort of roving commissions and that kind of thing. So I've been a mainstream of the news and current affairs output of STV for over 30 years.
Wow. I mean, I've been with my current employer for over 21 years. So to hear your story, it's like, wow, God, that's a few years left for me then to catch up.
Yeah, I mean, it's an industry which has changed quite a lot. When I went in, actually, before that, I was a couple of years at BBC Radio, and a name that will be known to people in Scotland is our news anchor, John Mackay. John is actually the longest-serving news anchor in the history of STV. If we're to look at all of the sort of big names of the station, going all the way back to 1957 when the station went on air, we had Bill Tennant, who was probably the first news presenter. Then we had John Toy, who was the mainstay in the 1970s. Then for a long period of time, Shireen Nanjiani. But John Mackay's tenure actually surpasses all of those. And John started in BBC Radio as well. And we come from very, very similar backgrounds. We come from very ordinary working class backgrounds in Glasgow, although John's antecedents are in the Western Isles. And we used to always say that when we started in radio, we didn't think that we would make it because everybody who was around in radio at the time seemed terribly posh. And all the folk that tended to read the news in those days, some of them weren't journalists, they were actors and they were employed simply for their voice. And John, in fact, I think was told once, oh, you'll never make it, son. You don't have the right accent. And that kind of attitude was still around then. That would have been in the 1980s.
Well, that leads us very nicely on to the theme of the podcast today because, you know, it's all about very much exactly what you're saying. The underdogs, the people that others thought might not make it, or maybe they thought that themselves, and then they went on to sort of have the best career possible. And so I want to take you back to get a real sense of your upbringing, where you were from. So if you could give us an insight into like where you're from and your family circle, that would be great.
I was born on the 3rd of March 1963. I was, although I am lapsed, I was baptised in St Roch's Roman Catholic Church in an area of Glasgow called Gan Gad. Anybody that was born there calls it the Gan Gad. It's now called sort of Royston. It was an area which was heavy with Irish immigration and was a very sort of heavily Catholic area where the folk came from Irish Catholic backgrounds. When we were two, we moved to Castlemilk, which for people who don't know is a large peripherals estate in the southeast corner of the city, and we were there between the ages of 2 and 9. And then we moved to Cambuslang in Lanarkshire, and Cambuslang was an area which was, in those days, quite heavy with manufacturing. The Hoover factory in Cambuslang, which at its height employed something like 7,500 people. There was still a steelworks, the Clyde Bridge Steelworks. It had been a former mining area. So we moved to Cambuslang on the periphery of the city, but it was very much a working class community. And back in those days, because it was a former industrial area, the notions of solidarity and looking after one another and looking out for folk, and I suppose what you might call the sort of principles of trade unionism, fairness in the workplace, these things were very, very palpable back then in a way that they're probably not now, because that area has very, very little industry at all now. So I was essentially brought up in working class communities: Gamgad, Castlemilk, Cambuslang.
And do you know, I think one of the things that you said there that really hits the nail on the head for me is about looking out for each other. Because even now, like for me, even in my community, whilst, people are really lovely, it's as different, I think, than it was even when I was a child. The neighbourhoods. I remember my mum getting to, I had to get in the neighbour and borrow sugar, or my mum, I think my mum fiddled the meter at one point because she could give the neighbours some money to buy food. And, that was before I was born, actually, so it's going back a bit longer. But do you think, then sort of, I guess, a community spirit, when you don't have much, people just sort of look out for you?
Yeah, I think that life in working class communities has actually changed, and I think that people don't interact in the same way. I mean, hogmanay is a very, very big thing in Scotland. And when we were in Castlemilk, I can remember very, very clearly, and indeed in the early years when we moved to Cambuslang, at Hogmanay, we were 7 floors up in the Mitchell Hill flats. There was probably about 8 apartments on the 7th floor. And in the early hours of New Year's Eve, neighbours moved from one house to the other. They all wished one another a happy new year. That doesn't happen, I think, to the same extent now. But you're right. I think that when you're very young, in actual fact, you're not actually conscious of class, I would have said when I was very young, because everybody that lives around you are all in similar circumstances. Your pals' parents earn a similar amount of money. You tend to all dress the same. Back then, you didn't go on foreign holidays because there wasn't enough money. But there was a sort of palpable sense of self, and there was a palpable sense of community. I mean, people used to say that the worst crime in the world wasn't to murder somebody. The worst crime in the world was to steal from your neighbour who had very, very little. And I mean, I can remember people saying that, people getting very angry about those kinds of things. And I think probably one of the things that's changed, what I would call the values of the respectable working class, to a certain extent, I think have been lost in the mists of time. I think you have to go to a generation who are in their 70s and their 80s, who would espouse the kind of values that were instilled in me when I was growing up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. And so, when you were growing up in your family home, and you were talking about you were several floors up in the high flats, who was in the house at that point?
Um, Myself, my brother Stephen, who's a year younger, and my youngest brother Brian arrived in 1971. So latterly, there was mother, father, and 3 boys.
Yeah. And what did your parents do? Were they in kind of like what you would class as sort of average working class
Yeah,
jobs?
my father, what jobs did he do? He drove for a brewer's at one point. He uh, then drove the buses for a period of time. And then latterly, he drove for the City Council's cleansing department. Mum was in a whole series of jobs. Latterly, she was a school cleaner at one of the local schools, and she worked in R.S. McCall's, she worked in a baker's, she worked in a factory in East Kilbride at one point. So it was two parents who both had to work, because you needed both parents to work if you were frankly going to send your kids out appropriately attired.
Yeah. And I guess, the fact, the fact that they didn't have like kind of big professional jobs in those days, and it actually now, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, because it's all about the values that they instill in you as a person, that you have to work hard or you don't get the food on the table, you don't get the luxuries or you don't get the nice clothes, even if they're secondhand or hand-me-downs. So and do you think for you, like what were the kind of main things that your parents sort of instilled in you as kids, even subconsciously, without even thinking about it?
I think that one of the things is actually how you treat other people. I mean, very basic things like if you see a pensioner struggling with a bag of shopping, go and help the pensioner, take the shopping to the door. Politeness doesn't cost anything. Be polite. Treat people as you would expect them to treat you. Don't be intolerant because people are different. I mean, you come from the west of Scotland, and there's a little culture here which tends to be associated with football and things, which people make judgments about folk because they go to different schools, support a different football team, or worship in a different church. And we were always brought up not to be intolerant, to be understanding, and to be polite. These, I think, I mean, these are not working class values. They're just human values which anyone would have. But I see youngsters nowadays who, jumping about in the bus or the train. That tended not to happen when I was young. Um, Answering back your elders, that was a complete and utter no-no because it was disrespectful. So I've always sort of tried to live my life by those values.
Yeah, that's really lovely to hear. I mean, it's the same. Like your family sounds very much like mine, and actually, as you say, probably the most of West of Scotland actually lived by these values because, I was the youngest of seven kids. So even my brothers and sisters, because there was quite a large age gap, to me they were my elders, and my mom would be like, "You respect your elders," and that was even your siblings. Apart from Maureen, who was very close in age, so we used to fight all the time. But other than that, the rest of them, it was respect your elders because they were so much older. So they had that kind of hierarchical place in the family. And my eldest brother being the oldest, my eldest sister, they were the sort of, if mum and dad weren't around, they were the ones that you listened to, very much so, or you get a leathering.
Well, that was one thing which I do disapprove of because I don't think I was we were never sort of strapped or hit, but there was always the threat if you
That
don't
was the
behave
same,
yourself.
yeah. Yeah, I have to clarify, my parents never lifted a finger to me, but it was a fear of it. It was
Yeah.
that my mum used to take her slipper off. But she never, and that's not true. A couple of times she did hit me in the back of the thigh and the back of my legs, and it was a stung, and I knew. But my family never hit me. But it was the fear of it. It was like the parents had, not so much my dad. He was just too soft, but my mum had this sort of look about her that you thought, I actually don't want to push that button because I don't know what she'll do. Although she never did anything. So yeah,
Yeah.
totally with you on that. And so for you, obviously it sounds to me as if, you lived probably quite a lovely life, as you say, your friends are in the same boat, your family were all similar, there was camaraderie, they all got together, and, it does sound really nice, but were you ever aware, whilst you knew that, all your friends were the same, were you cognizant to the fact that there were certain struggles growing up, maybe financially for your parents?
Well, I was conscious that they didn't have pots of money. I mean, we didn't take holidays, for example, and the idea. I mean, although sort of foreign holidays, I suspect, people started to take them in the 1970s in Britain. I mean, before that, it tended to be holidays at caravan parks or these awful seaside resorts. Well, they weren't awful at the time, but looking back on it, they seem fairly awful. There wasn't a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of holidays, but and this is, I think, is a really important thing. Although they didn't have anything, everything that they did have was spent on the three boys. And I always sort of, when I went on to have a career where I never had to worry about money, or paying a bill or making a decision which involved money, I look back and I thought, their devotion to their children was amazing. 'Cause one of the other things was that if you can't afford it, don't buy it. And tick was not a good word. And the only sense in which they would ever take higher purchases if there was something where it was going to take too long to save up for it. But they were careful with the money, and everything that they did for us.
Yeah, they sound amazing. As I say, very much similar to my family and our kind of principles. Even to now, I remember getting my first mortgage, and I was petrified because to me that was debt. Although as an adult looking at it, you're like, well, come on, it's an investment. But at the time, it was so scary because I never bought anything I couldn't afford, or if I did get it on credit, I always had the money there that if something happened, I could actually give them it. But instead of that, I just kept it. So not that I got much interest in the bank, mind you, but that's another story for another podcast. And so when you're obviously growing up with your family, and we sort of sort of given a sense of how things were. What were you like at school? Were you academic, or how did that sort of play out?
I really wanted to do politics, philosophy, and economics at university, but I thought unemployment's very high. This might not be the best route into work. So I opted to do law at Strathclyde instead. That was the fallback position. And I suppose that's the first time that I actually encountered middle class folk and folk who'd gone to private schools, because probably about half the class at Strathclyde were privately educated.
Right. Okay, so then you're starting to get a sense of different kind of people, different backgrounds. And so, I mean, did you all kind of just go on like normal? I guess there was no difference because you were all sort of in the same boat, or was there a difference?
No, I mean, I remember somebody saying to me years ago at university, and he had been at Hutcherson Grammar School, which is a private school on the south side of Glasgow, and his family had a local business, and he tended to socialise with people who were only in his own class. He lived in Pollokshields, and one of these grand houses in Pollokshields. And he once said to me, he said, "It's all right for you. You can talk to anybody because you come from a working class background and you converse quite easily with people who are not from a working class background." He literally didn't meet anyone that was working class until he went to university. And that's in a city which tends to sort of pride itself in a sense of egalitarianism. Quite odd.
Yeah, I mean, I'm finding this through the conversations that I'm having. When you're, and again, we're talking class because it's the theme of the podcast. This is just anybody generally. However, I do think a lot of working class people do have a slight edge because you have to be able to flip between two things, don't you? So I remember being a kid in the playground. And I'd probably speak polite there because the teachers would hear me. But in the street, maybe a bit more slang. And then if I speak to someone, say in business, then you would polish up how you speak. And so, did you find that you were doing both things, even encountering sort of middle class people? Were you adjusting to the way you spoke, or were you just Bernard and you talked the way you talked?
No, I mean, one of the things I was encouraged to do, this would probably be my English teacher, if you were reading aloud in class, and I used to blush a lot when I was young and go very red in the face because he would ask people to read aloud. And I was always very conscious that whenever I read, read aloud, my voice seemed to carry across the classroom. And I used to get very embarrassed by this. But he used to always say, "I don't mind if you murder the language uh, outside in the playground, but in here, you have to speak it properly and you have to enunciate and you have to be clear." And that taught me a very, very important lesson. Uh, when I went into broadcasting, it's not accent that's important, it's the clarity of your communication. And the voice that you speak in a sense, is neither here nor there. Because you can have very posh people who do that thing where they almost slur their words. I mean, terribly posh people almost sound drunk. Um, I, I, I remember interviewing, I got Hector Monroe. He was a lovely man, actually, Hector Monroe. And he was just one of these individuals, and it was all sort of, it's all down there, it's all like that, it's all sort of, and I can't make out a word he's saying. There was just this noise, and I kept getting back to my English teacher: be clear in your communication. So what I got from school was accent is not important, but if you're not clear, you won't be understood.
Ah, so now you can see why you're so successful. So, okay, that's a really good point. And when you were at uni, obviously, I'm making the assumption here that you passed your degree or whatever
No,
course you were
no, I did
doing. Did you
not.
not? No? Okay. So and there's number one lesson. Never assume anything. I was always told that. I just thought I would hedge my bets, but I was a bit of a gambling mood today.
Yeah. No, I studied law and I sort of hurtled to the third year. But probably I was one of these individuals who literally didn't have a pint of beer uh, before I was sort of 18. And I sort of made up for it after I was 18, and that
Last night.
probably explains the journalism. And I got a fondness for the bar, and it wasn't a case I flunked the exams. I simply didn't go, and we actually took a stupid decision just to leave because I had nothing to leave to, and this would have been about 1984, when I mean unemployment was through the roof, and there was that sense: what do I do? Um, it was a cracker's decision, and some people used to say to me later on in my career, "Oh, you present programs as, or you interview as if you're a lawyer. Uh, did you study law?" I said, "Well, I did actually study law," and they said, "Well, you probably should have gone to the bar and become an advocate, which would have been certainly financially much more rewarding." But I don't regret any of the career choices that I took. So what did I do? First of all, I worked in a miners' welfare club, the Cambuslang Miners' Welfare, which was a great education because I was quite shy as a very young man. And if you're going to survive as a barman in the pit boot end of a miners' welfare club, you have to roll with the punches and you have to develop a personality. And when I look back on it, my time, uh, about 3 years working behind a bar, was a great education in social interaction.
Spookily, your story is very, very, very similar to mine. So I got into uni to study business. And I remember when I started, I got bursary. So my parents obviously didn't earn enough. Well, actually, that's not true. My mum had passed at this point, and my dad was older and he was retired. So I got a bursary. And I always remember, like, I thought, oh my God, this is more money than I've ever had in my life. And so I grudged spending it on books. I thought that's a waste, although I needed the books. Bizarrely, because I was like, oh my God, I've got all this money. And for clarity, it wasn't that much, but to me, it was a lot. And I found the union. And so I spent more time, and I didn't spend a lot of the money because it was a bit tight. I don't like spending a lot of money on alcohol, but unless it's a really good bottle of wine. But I remember drinking cider and blackcurrant. That was my tipple, and it was the cheapest drink I could get. And I like kind of drinks that are more like juice until as I say, until I get into wine. And I remember the head of department said to me, Lynn, you're not really coming to class. And I was like, I know. And I was like, do you think I should leave? And he was like, yeah, I think so. And basically what he was saying to me is, I think you should leave before we throw you out. So he was very nice about it. And I left, and I remember that I was working in a sports shop. So I was similar to you because I was interacting with customers. I was earning next to nothing. But that, in the same way as your bar job, was just a very good grounding of dealing with people, sussing people out. I mean, for me, I went on to do more of a sales career. So I then started learning. I actually had all these traits that I had never knew existed. And I did get into media as well. But I'm going to want to hear your story first. I'll share a bit of mine as we go. But you've obviously been in this bar. So then what was your next step?
Well, I was politically active when I was young. Um, I joined the Labour Party at 16, and I was out by 21. I then, rush of blood to the head, all mad looking back on it. I joined the SDP, if you can remember that far back. And through my political activity, there was a guy called Dr. Dixon Mabon. Dr. Dixon Mabon was the Labour MP for Greenock and Port Glasgow between 1955 and 83. He had defected to the SDP. He was out of Parliament. He was trying to get into Parliament, and he suggested that I go and work for him. And so I did, running his office, writing press releases, that kind of thing. And he had been a very significant figure in Scottish politics. Probably the most prominent politician, I would argue, in the post-war period in Scotland was Willie Ross, who was Harold Wilson's Secretary of State. Willie Ross was Secretary of State from 64 to 70 and then 74 to 76. And Dick Mabon was his deputy, his Minister of State. Then after Harold Wilson resigned in March of 76 and Jim Callaghan became Prime Minister, Callaghan sent Dick Mabon to be Tony Benn's Minister of State at the Department of Energy. And Dick Mabon was known as Mr. Oil because he was the minister when North Sea oil came on stream in 1975. So he was a sort of big figure in politics with a lot of business connections. I think I'm correct in saying he was the largest private shareholder in Radio Clyde, which had been set up by Jimmy Gordon in 1973. Jimmy Gordon was the first political editor of STV. I was the third. And I learned a lot from Dick Mabon, who himself came from modest beginnings in Postle Park. So I worked for him, and through working for him, I got to know journalists. And probably around about 87, 88, I thought, I think that's where I would like to go. And back then, I spoke to everybody who was a journalist. I would go to the pub with them. I would debate with them. They now call this kind of interaction networking. I just spoke to folk, and through basically meeting folk, I get offered a job. My first job was in broadcasting, was at the BBC, and then 34 years with STV.
Wow. And again, it's another synergy here because I remember when I was in the sports shop, similarly, I seen an ad because I promised my dad I would get a job because he was really worried because my mum had passed and he was sick. And I actually think this is just before he got sick. And I remember I seen an ad because we used to buy the Sun newspaper, and there was an ad for a promotions assistant stroke copy taker, and I didn't know what any of them meant. But the only key word to me was that you should be able to touch type, and I could touch type was the only skill I had, and I was good with people, but that was it. And I remember I hustled my way into that job. I think I don't know if I was maybe the only candidate, who knows, but I hustled my way in. I got this job, sort of hybrid and sort of I guess the promotions, and then I worked with the journalists, David Dinsmore, people like that. I worked with them writing copy and stuff, or not writing it, but just copy taking. And I then got to know everybody. And again, I didn't do it deliberately. It wasn't conscious, but I used to go and speak to Colin McClatchy, the MD. I would go and talk to Janice's PA. I would talk to people in the advertising teams. And it wasn't me trying to get anything out of it. I was just a nice person, I thought, and I was really interested in people.
This chimes, I mean, because at that age, I couldn't have plotted a way in because I wouldn't have known, and I wasn't conniving enough to think if I know that one, that will lead to that one, and that will get me in. It just wasn't like that. It was a case of meeting as many people and talking to as many people. And I mean, I'm glad I never ended up in a management position because I would have been lousy. I hate the way HR departments sit with templates and they tick little boxes. And I've always said, particularly when it comes to something like journalism, you can take somebody, doesn't need to be the pub, you can go for lunch or a coffee and just talk to them. And within about half an hour, you will know Do they have the nose for it? Do they have the temperament for it? Do they have the inquisitorial mind? Whereas sitting through a formal interview where you're ticking this, and the other thing is, I, I used to proudly boast I was the only one in the newsroom without a degree.
Me too. It's like a badge of honor almost. Everyone's degreed out their ears, and I'm like, yeah, I got here and I've had no degree. People are like, really? Yeah. When I was just back from Singapore. When I was there last week, I got talking to this Vietnamese girl. I was having dinner and she was on her own, and then she started just chatting to me. She was really lovely. But then she was asking me what I thought of her generation, and I was giving her some feedback, positive, negative, whatever. And then she was asking, "Oh, you must have a degree," and I was like, "Well, I actually don't." And but whereas in other countries, it's very frowned upon not to have that kind of thing. So we're very lucky that we're quite liberal, I guess, in how we think. Although not employers are, certainly not,
When I
certainly
used
not
to
for sure.
recommend people to hire, sometimes the head of department would say, why do you recommend that person? And I would always say, because they have no fear. They have absolutely no fear. And I remember watching one or two people at press conferences where, senior politicians, some of them quite pugilistic, and these younger reporters had absolutely no fear. They had confidence in their line of inquiry, and they weren't going to be bullied or kicked around. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's exactly what you want. You'll never see that, and you'll never ascertain that sitting in an interview with an HR matrix.
100% agree, absolutely. And so when you get into journalism and well, certainly even the political party, when you get into sort of the political party and in your career in broadcast, what did your family suddenly think about this? Because here's a wee guy from, the high flats now, I guess in a sort of celeb status to a degree. Yeah, well, what was going through their minds? What did they say to you?
I never ever asked them, and well, the, probably they knew that I was earning quite good money. This will show you how long ago it was. There was, 30 odd years ago, a very big expenses culture in journalism. And quite early on in my career, I was called in, and the boss was sitting with my expenses sheet clutched. And I thought, oh, no, 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 I've messed up here. And he said, it's about these expenses. And he threw them at me. He said, if upstairs think that you can survive in these expenses, they'll think we can all survive in these expenses. Go get spending. And I mean, it was just accepted that that's what you did. And, these were not necessarily whining and dining contacts. And I sometimes take my mother and father out. My father would say, "Who am I this week?" I said, "Well, I think you could be David Steele, and Mummy could be Judy Steele, and we'll stick that on the expenses." Everybody did it. Everybody did it. But I remember Gus MacDonald, later Lord MacDonald of Tradeston. He started off as director of programmes at STV in '86, moved to become managing director, then left to become an industry minister at the Scottish office after Labour won the election in '97. But Gus MacDonald in the mid '90s, it would have been, stood in Studio C and gravely announced the days of the company behaving like an internal welfare state are over, and that marked the end of the good old days.
Jeez, my goodness, until then you were having the life of Riley. I mean, it must have been amazing because you think to yourself, growing up, you've had to watch all your pennies. And yes, by that point you're earning reasonably well, pretty good. But to have almost a bit of a free rein, I mean, obviously there's a limit, but it sounds to me as if you were just like, here's a blank checkbook, off you go. And that's just, I mean, that must have felt great.
I mean, the first couple of years when I worked at STV were the happiest of my 34 years there, and I actually was doing quite a junior job initially, working as a researcher. I didn't go in and go on screen immediately, but they were marvelous. I mean, the thing that sort of tickled me was that growing up, and when I was growing up, there were only three channels. There was BBC One, STV, and BBC Two. And I suppose BBC Two in those days was a little bit what Channel 4 became. It was for marketed as for sort of minority tastes, very heavy on science and arts programs and so on. So there was really only two channels. And everyone that was a news journalist in Scotland in the 70s was probably known to most of the public because there was only two channels to watch. And I remember going into the building and pinching myself because I was suddenly sat in the canteen talking to people that I'd grown up with. And you know, if you're in a working class community, television may as well be Hollywood. Your local news reporter may as well be a Hollywood A-lister because you feel as if you know them. And I had to pinch myself that I was sort of sat with people that I had grown up with. The only thing my parents ever asked me about work was about the sort of personalities of the station. What's so and so like? Are they good to talk to? Are they a bit of a laugh? Or are they stuck up? That kind of stuff. And I would always give them a sort of slight insight into uh, the sort of culture at the station, but I kept it clean.
Tell them too much. And how did you get from, like, you were saying you were a researcher and then obviously you became the face of TV. How did that leap take place? Did someone spot you and think you were good, or yeah, what happened?
When I was, um, I'd been freelancing at BBC Radio, um, and then STV came in and hired me because I knew the politics producer, John Brown. I was hired for STV, and when I was hired, I didn't find this out till later. He hired me with the intention that I would eventually go on screen. So I sort of, I mean, I was on screen probably pretty quickly. I mean, I was only doing research stuff for about 6 months. And then there was a sort of changing of the guard in 1992. Quite a lot of senior people were helped out of the company, if I can sort of put it diplomatically. And there were all sorts of opportunities which arose. And so I was doing studio stuff from about 1992 onwards. And as sometimes happens, if you're young and you're on the way up, uh, you're the blue-eyed boy, but never lasts forever. Never
Yeah.
ever lasts forever in broadcasting because you're new, you're fresh, you're a different voice. And then they'll get bored with you and they'll replace you with somebody younger who's a fresher voice and all of that. I was just very, very lucky that I was in the right place at the right time. And so much of what happens in careers isn't actually down to objective assessments about who's the most able for the job. It's whether or not you're lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of it is serendipity. I do think we make our own luck a lot of the time, but it's hanging out, in the right places with the right people, the right kind of circles, and just the wonderful things happen. I think just when people converge and connect, and I often say that to people I know is like, if you're hanging out with your mates, that's fine, that's good. But maybe get into circles where, and not deliberately, just get into different places. You'll meet different types of people with different views of the world. They'll have different contacts. And before you know it, things can just happen. And I think that for my son, he was working in retail, and I said to him, it was like a designer store, flannels, and I said, okay, you're going to have three types of customer. You're going to have, and this is, people are probably going to berate me for this, but in my head it's true. So you get three types of customer. You've got the successful person who has done really well, and they have got the luxuries and they can afford things, and they could be your potential employer. You've got the person who is, just lives a good life. They've earned, they've worked hard and they've earned money and they've saved up to get what they want. Or you'll get the drug dealer. So it was like, but you need to be careful who's coming through that door, because often not, the successful person won't be how they look. They will probably most often be the most scruffiest because they don't have to
Absolutely.
prove anything. So
Absolutely.
and he's listening. He's met some people who I think he'll get. He's got connections now, but he's now quickly understanding the power of his network. Because I brought him up technically as a working class lad, because I think it didn't do me any harm. He does have luxuries in other ways, but we still live in Clydebank, so we still live in the working class town I was brought up in. But I do it deliberately. It's a bit like the not having the degree thing. It's like that badge of honor, still
Well,
being
you
able
see,
to live here.
here's another thing which we have in common. It is quite freaky, because in the days when I first went into STV, if I wanted to buy a nice flat in the West End of Glasgow. Uh, the money was decent enough, and I could have gone out and bought a flat in the West End of Glasgow, but I didn't. I bought a flat in the East End of Glasgow, and I've been in Denniston for over 30 years because I like the fact that it's a sort of slightly mixed community. I don't like the uniformity, and all of my friends live in the West End. I love them all to death, but there is a sense in which there is a bit of sort of uniformity there, and it wasn't an act of rebellion or anything like that. It was simply a case of I'm comfortable here, I like here, I don't need to live there.
Yeah. I mean, you get to a level of success, you don't have to prove it. And what's very striking and very clear to me is that you've always remained true to who you are and how you were brought up. Because you quite easily could have, had your posh house in Bearsden, which is fine, because I know people there who have posh houses in Bearsden and they're amazing as well. But
Well,
to you,
I once said to friends who were threatening to move to Bearsden, I would throw myself in front of the removal van.
just to prove a point, see, you were true to your roots then. And so, one of the things I want to ask is, I can imagine, you were saying like your family didn't really say anything. They were more interested in who the celebs were and what they were like as people. But there must have been a point, surely, and maybe you don't know about it because they didn't tell you, where they maybe gathered around the TV and they're like, right, he's on the screen now. There must have been an element of that because that's really exciting. That to them would have been Hollywood.
They probably did. I mean, because all the big election debate programs I chaired for over 25 years, the through the night election programs for 8 and 9 hours, they probably did. But I never, I don't know about you, I never actually talk about my work. If you're socializing with people that work in the office, you inevitably talk about your work. But friends that I have, lots of friends who are not in journalism, I never talk about my work. I'm not interested in talking about my work. I'm actually interested in learning about them. I mean, I think one of the great things about friendships is that is discovering people who are different with different ideas and different tastes and different backgrounds and all of that kind of stuff. That's your work. Why would you take your work into your social life? And I literally uh, never ever would go out and see them at the weekend and talk to them about my working week because it didn't interest me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, my family, my friends, I do talk about it sometimes because often they will ask me about it. Tell me about your work. What is it you do? They don't think I work. My brother-in-law will joke about how I go away on my work holidays because it's literally I'm traveling overseas and I'm doing different things. But it's just really funny because to them that's just not the real world. It's just like they have got very manual jobs and actually I think sometimes they probably do work much harder than what I think I work, although I think I work really hard. I'm not saving lives and it's a very different mentality. And
Absolutely. I mean,
one of
I was at my leaving do last night. I sort of made the point that at the station, uh, there's the security people on the way in. There's the guy that runs the mailroom. There's the people who are sort of cleaning the office, and uh, there are junior reporters, there are senior reporters, all of this kind of stuff. I never, ever, ever distinguish between people. There's no hierarchy as far as I'm concerned. And in actual fact, in the when we had a large canteen at STV in the old days, I was very often to be found with Carol and Margaret, who were the two canteen women, simply because they were so funny. The funniest people were the folk that lived in the canteen, and
yeah,
I was always just I was from Margaret was from a Rangers supporting background, and she had a Bacardi Breezer which was orange, and Carol was from a Celtic supporting background, and she had a Bacardi Breezer which was green. They were very, very funny women, very
it's
funny
just
women.
the banter, isn't it? I mean, I remember when I was talking about News UK, when I would go around and talk to everybody, it wasn't just the MDs, it was like the security people as well, or the lady at reception, or Yeah, because to us, I mean, to any human being, if you're a good human being, people are people. It doesn't matter your stature. We all start the same and we'll all end the same. And it's just about the journey and everybody who interconnects, everybody holds a value in different ways, whether it be they're just really good banter, it's a great laugh, whether they have connections, whether they don't, whether they're just good people, and that's the way I really, and I love to hear this because it's the way I see the world as well. And when you're talking about this sort of journey and to sort of, I guess, wrap up, if you like, I would love to know, did you ever have any shadow of doubt in your abilities or your belonging or how you fitted in? You were saying that your friend was told that once. What did you think in yourself?
I never ever, when I was covering, my area was politics. So I was around prime ministers, first ministers, cabinet ministers. Uh, there would be an overlap with business leaders and that kind of thing. I was never, ever, ever had any sense of self doubt on the terrain in which I was comfortable, and that was politics. Um, uh, if did I have self doubt? Yeah, I would occasionally say that story's not for me. I don't know enough about that. I think it's a strength to say I don't know enough about that. I am not the best person for this. You should give this to someone else. So something which was maybe more sort of in the culture field or the arts field. Although I mean, I did a program called 7 Days where, with people like John Byrne on the program, Jack Vetriano, Norman Foster, the architect, and it wasn't as if I didn't know anything about these areas or I didn't have an opinion because, in a sense, an interview is in part what we're doing. It's a conversation. But I would always be slightly wary that this is not my area of expertise. When it came to politics, I never had any self doubt at all. But sometime a little voice in my head would say, this interview's not for you.
I think that's very fair words. And to finish then, the final point, I would love to know what would you say are your kind of two or three biggest tips you could give to anyone who's maybe sitting in a place at the moment where they're perhaps a little bit lost, they kind of don't know where they're going, the midlife crisis or younger crisis, whatever. People that, COVID has really hit people as well, and I think it's hard for people to sort of get out of that. But yeah, what would be your sort of main pieces of advice?
I would say, number one, in any line of work, follow your passion because you enjoy doing it. Don't follow a line because you think it's necessarily financially rewarding where it's not you, because the ennui will set in fairly quickly. So decide on what your passion is and follow your passion. Secondly, never be told by anyone this is not for the likes of you. Because somebody that says this is not for the likes of you is one individual with one opinion. And you might meet a second person who will have a completely and utterly different opinion. And I think the third thing is don't have preconceptions about folks. Sometimes people will say, I don't like to talk to him or I don't like to talk to her because, she's very, very elevated. Gets back to this point. Do not judge the book by its cover. So follow what you really, really believe in. Never accept that something is not for you. And don't be afraid to speak to people, now called networking. Don't be afraid to speak to people in order to get on. I said to colleagues last night, at the end of the day, whether you work in that mailroom or whether you're in the canteen or whether you're a senior journalist, we are all just workers at the end of the day. We all have our labour to sell. We're all paid a different rate. And I was very much using it as an argument because for 20 years I was the National Union of Journalists, Father of the Chapel at STV, representing colleagues. It doesn't matter what you do, but you actually have to act together, because if you don't act together, you'll all hang separately.
Well, thank you so much for those wise words. I hope you have an amazing retirement. Obviously, you've got lots of memories to look back on, but
I'm going
thank
to
you so
spend more
much.
time with our mutual friend Susan Maxwell.
I
Um,
know. Next time we'll do that. Next time for sure. We'll meet in Glasgow, West End or East End. Happy to go
or
either way.
Clydebank. I'll come to Clydebank.
Please do. All right. Thank you so much, Bernard.
Not a problem. Nice to see you.